get, okay, I mute back there, Dee, I'm muting you. Almost Happy New Year. I hope everybody had a good Christmas. We've got people from Canada online. Kelly's online. She thanks everybody for the gift that we sent her. And we've also got Diane from North Carolina, and we've got Julie and Bob from Minnesota.
Oh, man. Must be a football game.
It is 3:25, you guys. The Green Bay Packers played the Minnesota Vikings, a very important game. And watch for number 89. Cindy says they watch and they look at the back of the that's what we do too. Yeah, it's on the channel we get. It's on Fox Sports.
If I had known that, I would have gotten my name on the back of my shirt so they could all be excited.
Where are you going?
I'll be right back.
Okay. Let me see. Other announcements, just quickly, Terry Bayamonte's birthday, she's not on. She's turned 70 today. So if any of you got contact information from her, a happy birthday is good. Some of them are not on because she had a big bash last night, which I understand. Luis hurt his foot again, just because dancing. Other prayers, we saw Cherie last night. She was actually at the party and she had a, what do you call it, small stroke, TB. But she looked good, and that continues prayers for her and Phil. Continue prayers for Kelly. Special prayers today for Gina and her family. She's got a lot of things going on this week, so please keep them in your prayers for peace and wisdom.
Gene said he's going to be on the road this week, so it's a busy week to be traveling. So keep Gene in your prayers too. Lots of road time. Now we managed to come thankful, and one of the big reasons is because of this group, because of these people. Give us the gift of each other, the gift of the body, and we're thankful for that. These ones that we mentioned, and some of them week after week. And you know what a struggle that is for people to be in need. I know you understand that, but it's on our hearts. The other ones that with special times this week, we ask for your hand on them, and we trust that you will do that. We're going to enter some study that's difficult. People have been told not to have faith, not to have confidence in the words, and be with us. Be with us as we go over these things. Bring some joy in knowing that we have scriptures that were absolutely inspired by you and left for us. Help us to deliver that and open hearts to hear it. Amen.
So as we said last week, starting next Sunday, which is the first Sunday of January, we're going to start at the beginning of the Bible in Genesis. And so we thought it was a great time to do a 1-week study on the inerrancy of the Bible. And so this is
what that means.
Yeah, you would just, yeah, one sec. And so this is sort of unusual in the fact that we only have 2 Bible scriptures that I have outlined for the entire, and they're both at the end if we get there. So this is unusual for the way we study, but we think it's important. The inerrancy, do you want to talk about inerrancy first?
We get told there's so many people in our culture, in our TV, if you watch anything on the internet, that the scriptures are unreliable, that they are something you can't count on because they've been changed, they've been this, they've been that. And there are people who specialize in sort of picking things apart. And what I know, the gift that we hope to give through this one today, is at least some confidence. There are people who make a living off of telling you that the scriptures are something that you can't count on. They aren't good. And because I've studied a lot of this, I know enough to recognize that a whole lot of the time, what they're doing is cheating a bit. They're presenting um, some of the things they say may be true, but they don't mean what you think they mean. Again, if that sounds like politics, it should. And there's one guy in particular. Did you say mention about going into Genesis?
I did.
Before we go into Genesis, I don't think there's any part of the Bible that people have gotten more almost ashamed of. You're almost scared to talk about Genesis because you've been told that it's complete nonsense. I believe we're going to be able to show you that it's not what you've been told. I'm not going to tell you that the earth was created in 6 days. Those people do more harm than good. But it may not be what you think. It may not be what you've been told. But this is about the reliability of the scriptures all, as a whole today. And the gift, as I said, is maybe you come out of it going, oh, hey, I don't have to be ashamed of this. But there's one guy, you can look him up. His name is Dr. Mark Ehrman, Ehrman.
And we'll hear him reference later on.
He's going to come up in reference. But this guy has made a fortune off of teaching, especially college age kids, that, this is why I'm an atheist. This is why, and he has specialized in the scriptures, but he uses it and he cheats. He just doesn't tell the whole story. And if you only hear his version of it, you wind up thinking, oh my gosh, I mean, people, if I tell someone I believe in the Bible, they're going to call me a fool. They're going to call me a rube. Let's go through some stuff, and maybe by the end, you'll understand. The guy's capitalizing on it, and he cheats. He cheats a lot in what he chooses to show.
Do you want to show the example that he wrote, The Dark Side of Christmas?
So he did an interview that came out of maybe a little over a week ago. He's written a new book called The Dark Side of Christmas, and it's got one of those subtitles. Let me see. It's The Dark Side of Christmas, The Horrifying Details of Jesus' Birthday. The horrifying details of Jesus' birthday. And
he went to seminary, you guys.
Oh, yeah, he went to Princeton.
Princeton.
And Princeton Theological Seminary. And what maybe some of you don't understand, but when you see college-age kids, their comments are on his videos, and there are thousands and thousands of them, and they're just vicious in beating up anybody who claims that they believe in the Bible. Because if you do, one of the things that him and this young guy bring out in the interview, he says that the angel comes to Mary and says, you're gonna conceive a child, and Mary was given no choice. And at the end, they say in this video that Mary says, well, I'm God's slave. That's what they tell. And at one point, they even say that this God you believe in is a rapist. And there are college-age kids who are on that cusp, and they just get so worked up. That word that he used, not he used, but that he abuses. Mary says, I am your doula, which is like it's a bondservant. But back in those days, there were people that were, we say slaves. It's not like the slavery that you're familiar with. But at the end of their time, they're more like indentured servants. And at the end of their time, they realized their life was so much better that they want to stay with this person that they serve. And they actually ask, they say, I want to stay in your service for the rest of my life. Now, the word is doula, and doula can be a slave, but it's not like, somebody that gets whipped and beaten. These are people who are voluntary bond servants. And this man teaches people that Mary says, actually, what he says is, I am God's slave, as if she was rebelling against it. But what choice does she have? So I want to go through some of this. I hopefully want to be able to give you the gift of understanding that these people who are teaching this cheat. They don't tell you the whole truth, And if you wonder why you see college students that are so almost violently anti-religion, anti-Christianity, they've been taught at the hands of these people. So let's move forward. But that's who Dr. Bart Ehrman is. There's another guy that we're going to have a video of. His name is Dr. Daniel Wallace. He's the senior research professor of New Testament studies at the Dallas Theological Seminary, and he says some of this stuff obviously better than I can. But he's gonna talk about the discrepancies that they say exist in our scriptures and what that really means. And it's not what these other people are teaching.
And the one thing I want to add is I think we have the responsibility to be thinking Christians. And, you know, and faith is wonderful. But I was telling Scott, some people that act like, you know, and I use my mom as an example, and she was a wonderful God-fearing person, but she had something, you know, if you just have the faith, why, Mary, do you all, which you're talking to me, why do you always have to ask the second question? And so my faith, I was always scared that if I asked too many questions, I'd get an answer that didn't make sense. And that's what studying the Bible meant to me. Like if you ask too many questions, if you go too deep, there'll be something that won't hold water, and then I won't believe. And my mother would say to me, just don't ask questions, just have faith. I have come to believe that this book that we have has the answers, and it's okay to ask the questions. And it's not only okay, but it's our responsibility, and we shouldn't be afraid of asking the questions about this book.
The people who say, I believe every word in there literally, and they put blinders on, do more harm than good. And there's a point where Jesus says, I'm the good shepherd. And it doesn't mean that he went out on the hillside and tended sheep. I mean, you all understand that, right? You understand we have figures of speech, and we have ways of explaining things so that they make sense to the people you're talking to. But you can't say, I believe every word literally, unless you accept the idea that Jesus tended sheep for a living at least part of the time. Because he said, I'm the good shepherd. We have to be grown up about it. You have to be willing to look and ask questions. And there's no harm in asking questions. I think the message here today is there are answers to those questions.
So we're going to start with the Old Testament. And some of these are facts that we need to know. And first of all, remember that the Old Testament, first of all, is written in Hebrew, and copies of Old Testament manuscripts, they are not as old as what we have for New Testament manuscripts.
The actual documents, the parchment, the vellum, all those things, we don't have any of them that go back to the time of Moses, right? They don't exist. We have New Testament scriptures
that are actually older.
That are actually the actual paper papyrus. It's older than what we have for the Old Testament. And people teach that, and they say, see, you don't have anything that is authoritative. That's not true. And Mary will tell you why.
So, yeah.
What's the Torah and the Old Testament?
Great question.
Is the Torah documented?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Everything in the Old Testament was documented. We're going to talk about how. But the first 5 books, the Old Testament is divided into 3 parts: the law, the prophets, and what they call the writings, or the books of wisdom. Okay? The first 5 books are the Torah, the law. They're also known as the Pentateuch, Penta as in 5. But all of it not only was not only was it written down and documented, but what we have is very authoritative. Even though the paper, the papyrus, or the scrolls may not be, they don't go all the way back. There are reasons why we know they're authoritative. That's what we're going to talk about.
So with the Jewish people, they had professional scribes, and it was like part of the priesthood. These people, it was generation after generation. You were a scribe, and that was your job. And it was, like I said, it was generation after generation. It turned into what was called the Meserites. Is that the way I say it?
Masoretes.
Meserites. And the Meserites actually, these group of people existed for 4 or 5 centuries. That's like 500 years. And Scott, explain how the Jewish people, how these scribes worked.
So the scribes were incredibly meticulous about copying the scriptures. And anytime a scroll, anytime one of the written works got old, they get old and threadbare. The Jews considered it disrespectful to keep it in its tattered shape, and so they retired them, and in their place they put in these copies that were made by the Masoretes, the scribes, and they were beyond meticulous. But they, in addition to being meticulous, they did something where they would calculate the middle letter of a sentence. And they had records of how the copies are supposed to be. The middle letter of a sentence, the middle letter, the middle word of a page, the middle word of a book, what we call a book of the Bible. Jack, you came from a computer background, okay? You know what a checksum is. If all of you, any of you go to download a program off the internet, how do you know that somebody hasn't injected a virus into it, right? The people who originally create what's called a checksum. And they do a whole bunch of calculations, but if you run a checksum on yours and it doesn't agree with the one that the makers did, something is damaged inside your file. The Masoretes did this same sort of thing. They had a lot of error checking. So if they've copied a page and then they go down and do the checksum on it and it doesn't add up, they'll discard the copy.
Let me read. So a lot of the stuff where we came from, it's a book called How We Got the Bible by Neil R. Lightfoot. And this was his life work. He wrote this book and republished it 3 times. He did in 1963, 1988, and 2001. He passed away in 2012, but he was from Abilene University. And this was his life work, making sure people understood where the Bible came from. But I'm going to read one thing about the Masoretes. The Masoretes sought ways and methods by which to eliminate scribal slips of addition or omission. This they achieved through intricate procedures of counting. They numbered the verses, words, and letters of each book. They counted the number of times each letter was used in each book. They noted verses that contained all the letters of the alphabet or a certain number of them. They calculated the middle letter, the middle word, the middle verse of the Pentateuch, the middle verse of the Psalms, the middle verse of the entire Hebrew Bible, and so forth. In fact, they counted almost everything that could be counted. With these safeguards and others, when a scribe finished making a copy of a book, he could then check the accuracy of this work before using it. That was their jobs, you guys. Are you okay?
Yeah. So we got another question. Aren't the Dead Sea Scrolls Old Testament? Yes. But even at that, those were in particular, they were kept longer than most because they were kept in those caves. The point we're trying to make is people will tell you, we don't have any documents that go all the way, any complete, because they're also partial. We don't have any complete copies of the Bible that go all the way back. Well, no, that's by design. What we're telling you is the Jews would retire the paper, the parchment, the vellum. When it got old and tattered, they thought it was disrespectful, so they didn't keep them around on purpose. They replaced them with new copies. the copies were made more painstakingly than I think any of us can imagine. They dedicated their entire lives to making good copies, right?
And so the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found in the late 1940s, and they were in these caves that we got to see when we were in Israel. And because they were in these caves next to the Dead Sea, they were kept. But these were like one of the book of Isaiah was in there, but there is not the entire book. It's parchments. But what they found was those sections of the Dead Sea, of the sections of the Old Testament that they found in the Dead Sea Scrolls are what is in the Old Testament. So, I mean, there's no discrepancies.
And we owe it to explain more fully on some of this stuff. If we run over time, then we'll pick it up next week. But she asked about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Virginia did.
Yeah.
There are people who understand what the Masoretes did with these documents. And that was the story that was understood. But there are other people who go, we don't believe that. You just keep making changes. You just keep, what you have is not authoritative. It's not the same thing that was written way back in the time of Moses. The reason the Dead Sea Scrolls were important is because they were stored in jars in a like zero humidity environment. They lasted, but when they found these pieces, they agreed with the modern day text. They agreed with the modern day documents. And they were people where they were able to say, see, we told you what we have today is good. This is 1,000 years old or more. And look, actually 2,000 plus now. Look, these agree with what we have today. And they were able to shut up a lot of the naysayers. Now, one other thing happened is that you remember the Jews got carried off to Babylon. And when they came back, there were a lot of their traditions had been destroyed, a lot of whose job was to take care of the temple. And there was a new group that made themselves scribes, right? They were actually what are known as Kenites. We've talked about them in some of our studies. But they're not descendants of Israel. They're not descendants of Abraham. They're a sort of an outside group. And they take over and they begin to intentionally modify scriptures to suit their needs. The Masoretes, oh geez, can you bear with me? Can I get a little bit school on you? Hebrew doesn't have vowels. It's all consonants. And that can be confusing because you can have, just like we have words like tear that comes out of your eyes and tear, like you tear a piece of paper, that can be confusing. Well, a language without vowels, sometimes you can have consonants and it could be two different words. Usually you look at one of the words and you go, well, that wouldn't possibly make sense here. But sometimes it might be a little tough. So these Masoretes, the old scribes, began putting dots that represent vowels. Okay, so that they tried to make things more clear, so that the meaning didn't get lost. But what you have to understand is the original consonants didn't go away. They didn't just start rewriting the scriptures. They put these little dots above and below and to the side, little marks. But that was clearly their marks. They left the original words alone. So if you want to go back to the original, this is the Masoretes. You want to go back and see the original, it's there. But these are our additions to try and help clear this up. And there's nothing wrong with that. But the point being that the original was held intact. Now, these new scribes that come in after the return from Babylon are a different matter. Those are the ones Jesus railed against. When you hear Jesus complaining about the Sadducees and the scribes, they sort of took over Judaism and they perverted it. And that's who he's railing against. He does. It's not that scribes are inherently unreliable as a way of copying the scriptures is that these people were intentionally perverting the scriptures. And we can tell the difference. We have enough records that we know which are which. And there are people who today spend their lives trying to make sure that what we've got is a valid version of the Old Testament. I'm content. I am more than content telling you that you don't have to look at the Old Testament and question whether or not it's valid. They went to incredible lengths. The fact that we don't have a piece of paper that goes back to Moses, a piece of skin is immaterial. It's this way because by design, because that's what they wanted.
I have a quick question. What did they write on? What kind of material?
In this book, and we decided that might get boring, that because it gets pretty detailed. But they started out writing on animal skins because that's what they had. And then papyrus comes along. Papyrus revolutionized everything. It's a plant. Egypt grows a lot. It's kind of like a reed. And if you press it out, you can make a paper out of it. And papyrus allowed us, so there's animal skins, which vellum technically is. This book kind of goes into details, but when papyrus comes along, it is much cheaper, much lighter, much less bulky, and so a lot of it's written on papyrus. But papyrus doesn't last as long, and that's why these people make copies so that when one of them wears out, we have another one that we can just say, here, let us take that one, and they literally put them in a sanctified building to await destruction, the ones that were getting old. The point is, they didn't want any copies out there that were destroyed and that maybe they weren't valid because you couldn't read them anymore. So they went to great lengths to make sure that didn't happen. It's not an accident that the Bible is the most well attested of any ancient writings. We know, writings of, I don't know, Plato and Aristotle and all those. People added and so it's like the stories of King Arthur. You can write any King Arthur story you want. And they just added and changed those things. You notice people are not attacking the works of Aristotle and Plato, even though we know they've been stepped on over time. They have a particular interest in trying to discredit the scriptures. And if I've got time, I'll get to the reason for that as well. The point is, the Old Testament is extremely well attested. And I am very confident in the accuracy and validity and authority of the Old Testament.
And by the time, and we'll get into this, we're going to talk about the New Testament, and then we're going to talk about the canon, which is what is included in both the Old and New Testament. But by the time of Jesus, they knew what was in the Old Testament. They knew the books. They knew the Pentateuch. They knew it. And we will prove that, or we'll show you that by scripture, that Jesus talked about how was it divided, the Old Testament?
The law, the prophets, and the writings.
So they knew the scriptures. They knew what we call today the Old Testament. Okay. We're gonna skip ahead a little bit to the New Testament. So the Old Testament, like we just talked about, it was done by these scribes and rewritten. The New Testament is a different story. And the scriptural or the textual, is it textual accuracy? Is that the word? Of the New Testament, there wasn't scribes that were writing it down. And remember, we now have Gentiles and Jews. So the world is different once the New Testament comes around. And how they're going to keep the New Testament is different. Do we want to just say something before we show the video?
Yeah, we're going to show a video. And as I said, he's much better than we can do. But there are people who teach, this Mark Ehrman teaches, that there are more than 5,000 textual variants of the New Testament. They have documents, they have parchments, they have scrolls, and they differ from each other. In fact, they all differ from each other. And he likes to tell that in a way that says, see, it's unreliable, it's just all made up. And I mean, I read people all the time who say it's all made up. Paul would write a letter, and other people would hear about it, and they go, can I get a copy of that? And they would jot it down themselves. And yes, there are differences between the manuscripts, but we're going to talk, or he'll talk more about why this is not a problem, how much volume we have to compare. And is Luis still with us?
Yeah.
Luis last week mentioned he got his foot broken. And you know, he told us about it. And I made a joke. I said that it was a bar fight, right? It sounded like he was about to get thrown out or go out a window. And I said it was a bar fight. Now, if somebody, Gene, if you were telling somebody, you would say, Scott said this with a nudge and a wink, right? You know what that means. It means I'm kidding. And somebody else, you know, Laura, you tell somebody, Scott said this tongue in cheek. Which one is wrong? Which one of those is inaccurate? Obviously, neither one is inaccurate. You both understand the meaning. And what they have found over these many, many manuscripts of the New Testament, once you begin comparing, is that the message itself is not damaged. Misspellings in those thousands of text variants, misspellings are counted. That doesn't change the underlying message. Yeah, right? You get that. People will tell half the story. Oh, look, there are 5,000 different versions of this. What they don't tell is it doesn't affect anything. These are minor. People in the early church were so eager to get the gospel out that they made copies. But we're smart people, and we have people who spend their life comparing the versions. And what you find is
It's amazing.
you can throw out the misspellings, you can throw out the figure of speech, you can throw it's instead of being something to cause you to doubt, it, as Mary says, it is totally amazing how consistent they are. And I suppose the last thing is I want to mention about, before we go to this video, translation. I've been told in churches and by people, well, you can translate it that way and somebody else can translate it another way. Well, not exactly. You can make up your anything you want to make up. But as we study, a lot of the time I go back to the original Greek for you. And when I do that, I think most of you are fairly content after you hear what the original Greek says. There aren't multiple ways to interpret that. It says what it says. Sometimes I will show you that a particular word has more depth behind it. That for instance, the word Messiah means anointed, but it means so much more. So when you go to teach Greek people, you have to get the Greek word for anointed, and then you have to give them the other information. This is what it means, not just oil on your head. It means so much more. And so there are words that have a lot of extra depth, but the words mean what they mean. Once you see it in the Greek, you can't just interpret something so wacky that it means the exact opposite. Technically you can, but that's not a translation. That's a perversion of it. And the overwhelming mass of what's in our scriptures is not subject to the kind of weird interpretations of what they call translation. It's just not subject to that. It's a silly thing to say. So why did they say it to you? There are people who want to bring it down. When we studied Revelation, near the end, I brought this point out. There are some people that even at the very end refuse to acknowledge God, right? They and I told you there are people who, no matter what, even at the end, are going to hold on. There's before we go to the video, and I'll cut it short at this. I found this verse in Romans. Paul is writing to the Romans, and he's talking about people who refuse to acknowledge God. Since they didn't acknowledge God, he gave them up to a depraved mind to do what ought not to be done. They become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, etc. But down near the end of this, I'll skip, they're slanderers and God haters. This is from Paul. He refers to people, certain people, as God haters. And that may be difficult for some of you to understand. It's not for me. I run into them on the internet all the time who literally hate. I mean, they're vicious, and they want to destroy anyone who says they believe in God or they believe in the scriptures. They are God haters. They're the people who, at the end of Revelation, in the face of everything that's going on, rage against God, who refuse to acknowledge the authority of God.
And those are not necessarily, do one short story, and then we need to get to the video. Do the story about Penn and Teller. Because it's not, he's not real. Scott is not saying.
I'm not railing against atheists.
Atheists, they're atheists, and Penn and Teller, the
Penn and Teller, how about I tell?
yeah, go ahead.
They're two magicians. They're famous guys, and they're very, very cool. Penn and Teller. Penn Jillette, the tall one who speaks, the other one doesn't speak. But Penn Jillette is an atheist, and he tells people, I'm an atheist. But he was after his show, people know he's an atheist, and someone came up to him and sort of shared their faith with him. They wanted to convince him not to be an atheist. And another person, after that one left, said, don't you hate it when people come up to you and do that? And his response was, no. If I really believed, if I were them and I really believed, how much would I have to hate you not to tell you about it? That's an atheist. I get it. I understand. He says, I don't believe, but he doesn't hate the people who believe. There are lots of people, and in our country, in our society, who literally hate the idea of God, and they hate people and they rage against them. And unfortunately, our children are being taught by them. What we want from today is to let some of you relax and tell you it's okay to believe this stuff. It's not what the pop culture says, that it's all make-believe. You can say that the origin, that there's no God, but you can't say that the scriptures themselves are unreliable. And we'll show why. You want to do the video?
Yeah, the video. Scott,
when Paul was writing that letter, he was a God hater.
He had been.
He was a God hater.
Yes.
So he knows what he's talking about.
He does.
So he's killing people because they believe. But he was following what he thought was the original, whatever that may mean. God hater and non-belief is two different stories.
That's absolutely.
God hater and belief are night and day.
Right.
And one is, I think, a worldly concept. I hate you, versus a heavenly joy that we're talking about here. So these two types of people are not.
They're not the same. And I'm not raging against people who say, I don't believe. I say in here fairly often, you're free to say, I don't believe that. But I'm going to tell you what the words say. And there's a difference between those things. I have no problem telling you I believe. Absolutely. I have, good cause to, but I can't make you believe it. But what I'm not going to do is let people say that's not what the words say, because the words most of the time are pretty darn clear. Let's play the video.
Scott did it while he's bringing this up. He did, this is a professor, and it's two different talks of the same professor. And this is the one from Dallas Seminary. And he cut things out to make it as succinct as possible. So grab a cup of coffee, but it is really good. You got the sound?
I do have the sound.
Okay.
And
start with question number one, then. How many variants do we have? Well, there's one way to measure this that Bart has been fond of saying, and this is one of the times that he actually understates the situation. Words in the New Testament. There are approximately 138,000 words in the Greek New Testament. Or if you were Brother Andrew, he would say there are 138,162 words in the Greek New Testament, because that's what shows up in our standard text today. So 138,000 words in the New Testament. What Bart likes to say is there are more variants in the manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. That's a big understatement. The latest figures are that we have about 500,000 textual variants in the manuscripts. Just the Greek manuscripts we're talking about, not other languages. The New Testament was translated into several different languages. We have quotations by it by people known as church fathers, patristic quotations. Just the manuscripts alone, we have far more variants than we do have words in the original. If this was the only piece of data we have, those of you who are not Christians would be rejoicing. Those of you who are Christians would be slitting your wrists. We have some more information, though, to tell you about. And the big thing I think that is crucial here to get is that the reason we have a lot of textual variants is because we have a lot of manuscripts. If we had one manuscript of the New Testament, it wouldn't disagree with itself. There would be no variants. But does that tell you what the original says? No, it's just the one manuscript that we'd have to deal with. What kinds of textual variations are there? And I'll be much faster about the rest of these. But I wanted to talk to you about the variants in the manuscripts. It's such important evidence to think about. Well, I could break this down into several different categories, but I can simplify it this way. Over 99% make virtually no difference at all. For example, there are spelling differences in the manuscripts that really affect nothing.
He's misspelled spelling.
The author of the fourth gospel, the Gospel of John, was a very creative speller. He spelled the same exact word 3 different ways within the space of 8 verses. These don't really affect anything. They can't even be translated. There are so many different kinds of things that don't get translated, difference in word order, spelling differences, other things. And so I have a question for you Greek geeks. How many ways are there to say John loves Mary in ancient Greek? Well, let me give you some issues. Now, if you don't know Greek, you still need to write the answers down, because this will show up on the exam tomorrow. There's word order differences. Greek can put it in any order at once. John loves Mary, Mary loves John, loves Mary, John loves John, Mary. It doesn't matter, because Greek is a highly inflected language. You tell what the subject is by the end. You tell what the direct object is by the ending. Then there's differences in spelling. For example, the name in John, for John in Greek, either has 2 N's in the middle or 1 N. Every time we see it, there are some manuscripts with 2 N's, some with 1. Ioannes or Ioannes. Pronounced the same, spelled differently. So how many ways are there to say John loves Mary in Greek? There's 8 different ways. I had to obviously put this in Greek. If I put this in English, it would say John loves Mary each time, and so you wouldn't get a sense. So you need to, I'll give you a little time to write these down so you have the data. It's not just this number of ways. There's another 8 ways to say John loves Mary. Same word for loves each time, and it's always translated John loves Mary. It's not Mary is loved by John. Every verse, every sentence, is translated John loves Mary. And some more ways, and more. I can assure you these are all different. This took me 8 hours one day to come up with this. So I hope you appreciate this. 96 ways to say John loves Mary in Greek without changing the basic meaning at all. But there's also conjunctions that are often untranslated that go along with sentences like this. And I just picked on a few of them, and so there's some more ways to say John loves Mary. 384 ways to say John loves Mary in Greek without changing anything. Now, there's actually more ways, but after 8 hours I felt that I proved my point. If we can say John loves Mary over 1,000 times in Greek without substantially changing the meaning, the number of textual variants for the New Testament is meaningless. It's a meaningless number. What counts is the nature of these variants. What really is affected? And the smallest category of variants are those that are both meaningful and viable. That is, they change the meaning to some degree, and they have a good chance of being authentic. That's what we mean by viable. Less than 1/5 of 1% of all textual variants fit this group. Here's a way to represent it. The big blue box is the number of textual variants we have. And when you hear about 500,000 textual variants, this is the way that most people think about it. But let's talk about the ones that are actually significant. It's that little yellow box in the corner. That's what we're really talking about. What we're focusing on are those that do change the meaning of the text to some degree. So let me give you a couple of illustrations. Here's one of my favorites, Mark chapter 9, verse 29. Jesus' disciples were trying to kick out some demons, cast out some demons, and they were unsuccessful. So he said to them, this kind can only be cast out by prayer and fasting. Or did he just say, by prayer, period? This is the only place in the entire New Testament where and fasting may be part of the original text in the sense of it's a command or a suggestion that you need to fast to do something. So maybe if some of you are involved in exorcisms, you might want to hedge your bet and pray and fast, or you might just pray. Most scholars think the original text ends with prayer, but maybe it also is fasting. And of course, just looking at me, you can tell that I agree with the shorter text, but let's not talk about that further. We don't have the original manuscripts of the New Testament. They all disappeared within a century, I'm pretty convinced, by copying and copying and copying. Frequent handling. The early church was far more concerned to get the gospel out than they were to do exact copying of the New Testament. And that actually is a blessing, because they didn't have those kinds of controls, and consequently you get copies that are not through just one stream, but tons of people all over the place are making these copies. So here's a man who lives in Corinth. He's going to be visiting Rome, and he says, hey, I heard Paul wrote a letter to you guys too. I want to write that out. Do you mind if I copy it when I get there? Sure, that's no problem. This happened, I'm sure, dozens and dozens of times over. And those manuscripts would have lasted as much as 80, 90 years, but would have fallen apart from all these copies being made. So we don't have the originals, they disappeared. And all the copies that we have disagree with each other at some point. Sometimes it's quite a few disagreements, but we have hundreds of thousands of textual variants among our manuscripts. So a question to ask here is, how badly did the scribes corrupt the New Testament? It's absolutely proven that they did. No two manuscripts are alike, so unless one of them is pristine, every single scribe made mistakes. So because the original manuscripts disappeared and because no two copies agree with each other completely, we have to do textual criticism. We can't just rely on one, it's imperfect. So scholars have to reconstruct it on that basis. But when you look at the number of textual variants, and there's hundreds of thousands of them, as Bart Ehrman likes to say, there are more textual variants than there are words in the original New Testament. That's actually an understatement. But you have to not just look at the number of variants, you have to look at the nature of these variants. And the best estimates are that at least 99.8% of them affect nothing. Most are spelling differences. There's different ways to spell John, there's different ways to spell Mary. They're not going to affect anything. But the 1/5 of 1% that do affect things are the ones that scholars talk about and disagree over on a number of these issues. But the bottom line is, it does not matter in some respects which New Testament you use, because no essential doctrine is jeopardized by any of these textual variants. Even Bart Ehrman, who wrote Misquoting Jesus, can say the same thing. So that's true on that end, but at the same time, we want to know what the original text said in all the details. And so the great majority of scholars have very few disagreements over these passages. For example, most scholars would say the long ending of Mark's Gospel, Mark 16, 9 through 20, is almost surely not authentic. And they still put it in their Bibles, typically smaller print or in brackets or footnote. The oldest authorities don't have this. So there's a wide consensus on the vast majority of textual variants. And again, there's no essential doctrine that's jeopardized by any of these textual variants. That is extremely comforting. It's very important to know that.
Yay.
We're back.
Anyhow, he cut things out of it, but it made it a very succinct because it went on. It is a professor talking.
Yeah, it's an hour long. The big point here is, and he makes it very well. Yeah, there are differences in the manuscripts because, as he said, people wanted to get the gospel out, and they said, "Let me get a copy of that." Almost none of them make any real difference. When he talked about Greek and he said John loves Mary, you could say John Mary loves. The way Greek is written, you know who's the subject and you know who's the one doing the action by the word itself. They take a base word and there's an ending, and so you know this is the person who loves and the other one is the person who is loved. It doesn't matter what order you put them in. There's some customary orders, but there are also a lot of times that people just do it because it doesn't matter. And the people who tell you don't trust the scriptures aren't telling you that part. They say, oh, look, these two are not the same. Somebody's lying to you. No, they're not. The words mean what the words mean. There are a few places where theologians argue. And it's why I don't like theologians, because nobody gets a grant for saying the same old thing. They want to come up with something new and exciting. But the fact is that little green box that he showed is the sum total of the discrepancies that they can really legitimately debate. I cut out a part, but that Bart Ehrman, the guy who I tell you specializes in trying to debunk the Bible, at the end of one of his books, there's an appendix, and they did put it in where somebody asked him, why do you think this destroys doctrine? And he says, well, it doesn't. He himself, at one point in his life, he knew that and he acknowledged it. But he has made so much money on speaking engagements, and he's found such a following, such an audience. He doesn't teach in a university. He does speaking engagements. So Mary said, we're going to go into Genesis. I would hope that some of this, some of you will look at this and say, maybe I don't have to be afraid of Genesis and go into it with an open mind and not be thinking, as I told you, I'm not going to tell you the world was created in 6 24-hour days. I'm not going to tell you that. That's foolishness. It is. And the people who say that, I'm sorry, they do more harm than good. There's no need for it. More to the point. Could God do something like that? Yeah, I mean, that's not the question. That's not what's happening in Genesis. So there's the first thing. Mary has an ending.
Well, and I want to read about the canon, first of all. So the canon, everybody's heard of the canon. And first of all, I'm going to read a paragraph here. The English word canon goes back to the Greek word canon, spelled with a K, and then to the Hebrew word Qanea. Its basic meaning is reed, our English word cane being derived from it. Since a reed was sometimes used as a measuring rod, the word canon came to mean a standard or rule. It was also used to refer to a list or an index, and when so applied to the Bible, denotes the list of books which are received as Holy Scripture. Thus, if one speaks of canonical writings, one is speaking of those books which are regarded as having divine authority and which comprise our Bible. Okay, so that's what the canon is. Now, I'm going to go through this rather quickly, and we are not making, how should I say it? I'm just going to tell you the facts. Okay, so in the Old Testament,
we have to make this up next week. We're out of time, and it's not fair to rush. You have good information, and we just have to relax. Everything doesn't have to end on
okay.
that sort of.
Okay, we're going to pick up the canon and what books are in the Bible in what order. Because, I'll give you a preview. Catholics have different books in the Bible than Protestants. Eastern Orthodox have some different books. But the New Testament, I will tell you, the Catholics and the Protestants and the Eastern Orthodox, they all have the same number of books in the Bible. It's an Old Testament thing, and we'll go through that and talk about it.
There's no reason to be threatened by this. The fact that the idea of the canon, that only certain things are included, there are other writings that are beneficial. In the book of Jude, he appears to refer to something known as the book of Enoch, which is lost to us. You can go buy a copy off of Amazon. It's complete garbage. Somebody just recreated it. But the fact is that even in the New Testament, Jude refers to a book that's not in our Bible. There's nothing wrong with that. But people over a long period of time found that certain things are consistent. They have stood the test of time. And those are the books that are in our Bible. There are other writings. I'm not threatened by anybody who reads anything. I've read plenty of Buddhist, Gnostic writings. I want to know. But there's a reason why the books that are in our Bible are the ones that are in our Bible. A very good reason. And it's not because some council of Nicene came along and decided it. Mostly those things, most of it was decided long before that. The Old Testament was absolutely decided long before that.
And the biggest reason we want to bring this up is, like I started with, I think that we have a responsibility to be educated Christians. And if someone's saying, any Bible you pick up, there's not even the same books in it. I mean, understanding what books are in the Bible, understanding the textual, hopefully you got the idea of the textual variations today, but we'll take it up on the canon next week before we start.
I think that's
Okay.
fair.
Okay.
And Mary, if you can send me that list, I'd appreciate it, of the canons.
Okay, we will do that.
God, we're amazed at times, humbled at times that you inspire words, that you care enough, that you've taught us. And then you've put on people's hearts the care of the importance of maintaining. We too often fall into the lazy category where we don't check for ourselves, and we're susceptible. You know that. Sometimes we let people drag down our faith because we don't know any better. We do know, though, because of the experience that we have, that there are truths. We know that we've seen these differences in our lives and the lives of people that we know. Give us the heart that questions, that counts, and the ability to come out stronger with our faith strengthened at the end. These ones we've prayed for, the ones that are traveling, how many people are going to be on the road. We don't know everyone, but this group, these people that we know, you've put us together for a reason, and they're on our hearts. Be with them as they travel. Be with them as they're with family. Let us feel your presence. Amen.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Mary.
There we go. Hope you guys have a good day. There we go. And
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Mary and Scott.
Football game at 3:25.
Have a great
Happy
Sunday. Thank
Happy
you.
New Year.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Happy
Be
New
safe,
Year,
everybody.
everybody. It started off wonderful
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
guys, for everyone.